Hi, I'm Eric, the security guy. Today I'm speaking with Jerry Bell, a Chief Information Security Officer and the administrator of infosec.exchange. Hi, Jerry, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here today. So we're discussing Mastodon, and for anyone who's not, for any of our viewers who don't know what Mastodon is, can you just give us a little intro on what it is and how it's different from big social media like Facebook or Twitter?
Oh, sure. So it is, as you say, very different than what you might be used to with services like Twitter or Facebook or some of the others. Although in function, it looks and feels pretty similar. It is the best way I can explain it is the merger between Twitter and email. Right? It is a messaging service similar to what Twitter has, where you can follow other people, you can exchange posts, and you can post pictures and share information. But the major difference is that it's federated. It's called a federated network. It is a group of independently run instances, and so in that way, it's more like an email system where, as everybody is familiar with email, you have a domain, and that domain is run by either Google or maybe you host one yourself or your ISP. In the world of Mastodon and the fediverse, each instance owner has registered their own domain, has their own infrastructure, and and along with that has their own rules that they are responsible for, kind of the end-to-end operation of that instance, the upkeep, and all of the goings on that particular instance. So it's different than what you see with Twitter, because there's no like monolithic company behind it. It's a network of volunteers. For the most part, there are a couple of companies, but each instance is independently owned and operated.
So I like that email analogy. If I stand up an email server, I get to decide who uses that email server. I can create the policies, et cetera. So as the administrator owner of infosec exchange, that's essentially where you come in. You set the policy and the rules for that server, and then how does that hook in? You mentioned fedverse again. For people who aren't familiar with that, how does, for example, infosec exchange connect into that larger network of other people running Mastodon systems?
There's a protocol called ActivityPub, and it's a W3C standard, and it's basically a protocol that operates on top of HTTPS. So nothing too crazy, but basically you have this mesh network of instances where similar to an email, if you're a user on infosec.exchange and you want to communicate with, let's say, somebody on ioc.exchange, you can make a reference to their username at ioc.exchange. There's also some additional overlay capabilities where you have what's called a federated timeline, and you can actually see all of the posts, mostly real time, that your instance is aware of, and your instance becomes aware of posts based on other people following people on other instances. So that if you're on a larger instance, that federated timeline can kind of look like a fire hose, because you'll see there's actually, I think, about 9 million people in the fediverse now. And by the way, there's a difference between the fediverse and Mastodon. Mastodon is a piece of software that implements the ActivityPub protocol, and it's an interface that you can create an account on and interact with other people. But it is only one of a bunch of different pieces of software. There's also photo sharing focused software like PixelFed. There's video sharing software like PeerTube, and there's There's blogging software like Write Freely. There's even other types of software like Mastodon, which is again more of a Twitter-like thing. Some is called Pleroma. There's a number of others that whose name escapes me at the moment. But all of that, all of those that ecosystem is what we call the fediverse, and so it's the smashing together of the word federated and universe to come up with the fediverse.
So can all those different systems interoperate with each other, or?
That's right.
So from Mastodon, for example, you could subscribe to someone who's using a different software and publishing videos. And
correct.
So Mastodon's just one way to connect to the fediverse. And as a user, for example, I'm obviously a user on infosec.exchange, like most infosec people seem to have migrated there, especially with what's going on at Twitter. Where is my content actually stored? So when I almost said tweet. It's not the right word. But when I post some content on infosec.exchange, where's that stored?
So its primary location is on some servers that I administer. Those servers are located in Germany, and there's no magic behind why they're in Germany. It's just the place that I happen to find the best deal on servers. There's a company called Hetzner that operates a pretty high scale data center operation that basically is the best price performance benefit that I've found. But when you make a post, obviously that post resides on your home instance, like infosec.exchange in your case. But obviously the whole point is to be able to communicate with people on other instances. And so when you post publicly, that post also goes out to other instances. So again, like IOC.exchange and Mastodon.social and on and on. And typically that it'll end up on all of the instances that have people that follow you.
Okay. So as a user, I should be aware then once I post that really is public. It's going to be distributed across multiple servers, and it's definitely out there then.
Far and wide, and there is some ability to limit how your posts are distributed. Obviously there's a standard public post which gets maximal exposure. Anybody can actually see it, and then there's what's called unlisted, where effectively it's public. Anybody could see it if they're following you, but it's not going to show up in a timeline unsolicited. Then there's what they call mentioned to people only, and that is unfortunately often thought of as direct messaging, which has actually been quite controversial, especially in the security world, because it's been, I would say, improperly equated with direct messaging. And it's really not a direct message. It's just a different type of public post where the only people who can see it are the people who are actually tagged in the post. So it's not it's not encrypted. It's not in any way secured beyond what any other post would be.
Is there any direct messaging or private messaging within Mastodon or the Fediverse, or would we be better off just to consider email for those purposes?
Beyond what I mentioned with the mentioned people only capability, there really isn't, and that I think is something that is going to have to change, or at least we're going to have to find a better way to integrate it with other more secure facilities. So what I've observed is a lot of people who want to have those kinds of private conversations and are concerned about the sense, the availability of that information to server administrators and whatnot. They'll use a service like Signal or Matrix or even Discord, which provides some additional security, like and then encryption and whatnot, that Mastodon does not.
So what else should people know if they're going to jump into Mastodon, the Fediverse?
There's quite a few things. Number one, obviously, is as I mentioned, your your posts are not are not. I'm not going to say that they're not badly protected. That they're widely accessible, right? And so if you make a post, it is by design being disseminated to many different instances. And in the case of a the direct message or the mentioned people only type of post, um, again, that is not end to end encrypted in it. And the administrator of any instance with a person that's mentioned on the post has the ability, although it's not straightforward, they have the ability to actually go into the database and actually see see the content of that. So that is that's a concern to some people. I would say in general, it is designed to be a public posting service, right? So I would not think about it as a means of, at this point at least, as a means of having sensitive communications with other people. Um, so that's one. I would say another is to make sure that you end up on a server or instance that has a set of server rules that align with your um, personality, I guess, or beliefs, because what ends up happening, because again, this is a highly federated network of independently operated servers. You know you rely on the administrators and moderators of each instance to enforce their rules. And what can happen is if an instance isn't doesn't have a reasonable set of rules, or they are poorly enforcing the rules that they do have, they can actually, that an instance can actually become kind of shunned from the fediverse, and so that kind of limits your ability as a user to participate. That's kind of a complicated situation. I will say there was a pretty high profile incident about a month ago or so where CISA, the U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, created an account on infosec.exchange, and that caused a pretty big flap because there's a lot of instances who are operated by and on behalf of um, people who don't really like law enforcement. And so we ended up being blocked by quite a few other smaller types of instances that are typically more catering towards anarchist type communities.
Just because his created an account there.
Just because, yes. And well, they created an account and we allowed them to do that. So you just have to be aware that there's lots of different communities on the Fediverse. I think I'd like to say we're pretty intolerant of intolerance, and so when you come to the Fediverse, the expectation is people should behave and be kind to each other, and that's something that I try to foster quite a lot. Not to be too paternalistic, but just if as contrasted with some of the other social media, which I think a lot of people, and myself included, believe are kind of geared intentionally towards fostering conflict. We're trying to create something that is more useful and supportive.
So it really segues into another question I want to ask you. I was going to ask later, but I think I'll ask right now. On, for example, on Twitter, there's been a lot of discussion of moderation versus censorship. I won't go into that whole quagmire, but how does that effectively work on Mastodon in the Fediverse? Because you're just mentioning that that's typically done at the at the per instance, the right or per node basis, but then that entire system could potentially, you said, be shunned by the rest of the Fediverse. How does that work in practice?
So each instance is responsible for moderating the activities of people operating on their instance. And so, for example, I on infosec.exchange, I have a team of about 8 moderators from around the world, and it's more of an art than a science. I will say that. We've created some I think pretty reasonable rules governing the behavior of the acceptable behavior on the instance. But again, we can control what people do on our instance. We can't control what people do on other instances. Although
Right.
we do see a lot of a lot of people on our instance reporting bad behavior on other instances, and so we can actually block accounts or limit the ability of other accounts to participate on our instance, and that happens quite a bit in the instance of let's say hate speech or spam or just harassment, and that happens from time to time, and it does get, I will admit, it does get really tricky when someone wants to say something controversial or overly controversial, and things that the hot buttons of late have been like the vaccine debates and um, you know racial issues and those sorts of things where there's a um, there's a there's strong opinions on either side. I'm not going to do the whole both sides things. I'm just going to say that there
There are
are
a lot
some.
of strong opinions on it. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that as the as the administrator or owner of infosec exchange, first of all, you're moderating what your users do. Now, does it essentially show you everything that's going on, or is it more of a complaint based approach, or how does that how does it
It's
work?
entirely complaint based. So it gives Mastodon and other software like it gives the ability for users to report a post or report an account, and and once that happens, it alerts the moderation team that there's an issue to go investigate. And we have a set of, I would say, pretty rudimentary moderation tools that allow us to to take a look at it and the issue and respond by either removing the post or issuing a warning or suspending the account or limiting the account's visibility and a couple of other actions.
Okay. So you don't your moderation team doesn't have to look at every single post. They're essentially looking at where there are complaints. So that's the kind of the within infosec exchange, and then you're saying coming from outside. For example, if people are following someone and that account is really posting something that's that you deem really offensive or illegal, etc., you can just block that user, so that will never be imported, or further information from them won't be imported into the system.
Correct. We can block it. We can block by user or by instance. Right.
So by default, if I decide I want to run my own instance, not saying that I do, but if I did, I could set that up. I could connect an instance, and by default, am I connected to everyone else?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Okay.
Similar again, it's similar to email. You can set up an email server tomorrow, and it's maybe a little easier than email because email of all of the issues with blacklists and whatnot, spam filtering. Yeah, basically yes.
Until I annoy enough people and they just say, no, we've just had enough of, I've had enough of Eric's server. And then you said either block it at a user or a server level.
Correct. That's pretty rare. It's certainly a lever that moderators and administrators have to pull, but I don't think it's all that common.
Right. So are most of the system owners doing a good job of moderating their own users?
I would say yes, but there's some caveats, right? There's, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000 instances right now, and it's kind of like on a power law distribution in terms of size. There's a handful of really large instances with somewhere about around 1 million members each, and then it kind of goes down from there. Infosec.exchange has about 40, just about 44,000 accounts, and there's a very long tail of smaller instances. And over the past couple of years, there's been some notable instances where instances have I'll just call it flamed out, right? They've turned into, or turned out to be, just troll instances, hate instances, and whatnot. So, notwithstanding that, I would say it's, for the most part, instances are well run outside of those that are set up for the express purpose of just trolling and purveying hate.
So my perception, and I'm just saying this is my perception, was that because of, and I won't go into details, the events going on at Twitter, it seems to me a lot of the infosec community that were on Twitter have moved to infosec.exchange. And I got to admit, for me, I'd heard of Mastodon, I'd heard of the fediverse, but I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to it. And suddenly it kind of felt like everyone was moving there. What's your experience been over the last several months with, have you, is that perception accurate? Have you seen a lot of people kind of suddenly shift into the fediverse, or is it just because of some of the folks I follow, I've seen that?
It's super, super accurate. So I set infosec.exchange up about almost 6 years ago. It'll be 6 years in the spring, and for most of its history, it was just a little side experiment that I had been running up until Twitter started to have its issues. I guess I'll call it that. And the infosec community is pretty tight knit, and not insular or not exclusionary, but we have strong connections with each other, and there's a strong sense of community. And so it is absolutely accurate to say that the infosec community kind of wholesale picked up. Obviously, there's a lot of people still on Twitter, but a lot of a good majority, I would say, of the community picked up and moved to Mastodon. One of the things I tried to do was, it was something I challenged myself with, was turning infosec.exchange into a soft landing spot. Right, the fediverse is intended again to be federated. It's it is it is a diffuse set of instances, and there's a lot of, by the way, there's a lot of other great infosec focused instances on the fediverse, like ioc.exchange and hackers.town and hachyderm.io and a whole bunch of others. And I have no unlike Twitter, like I don't have a growth target, or I don't have a target on how many people need to log in and whatnot. It's strictly a public good. It's a public service, and my expectation was people will come in through the infosec.exchange front door and go create their own instances, move to other instances, or maybe even stay. But one of the things I've found, though, is at least on our instance, there's a lot of very active people, and as compared to people or other instance administrators I've discussed this with, we have a really high level of engagement. And again, it's not something that I actively measure. It's just basically the number of people connected to the instance at any given time is really high relative to the overall number of accounts on the instance. And I think a big part of that is because, again, like, we rely on each other. We are kind of sharing stuff real time. And so it's a very valuable source of information, as well as kind of the personal camaraderie and whatnot.
Well, I mean, I had a great experience just this past week. I needed to reach someone at a particular company. I had no contacts. Their support people were, we'll say, slow to respond. And, I posted on infosec.exchange and, yeah, had a contact literally within 10 minutes. So that community is just extremely valuable. So speaking of that, the refreshing thing for me was there were no advertising, and things seemed to show up in my feed kind of in chronological order. I got the sense there wasn't that algorithmic manipulation that I'm used to seeing, and advertising. So what pays for this? Is this out of your pocket? Donations? How's this? What's the business model behind this? Given that there's we're so used to advertising driven social media, obviously this isn't that.
Yeah, there is no advertisements. There's no tracking cookies. There's no, we don't ask you for any information that's not needed just to get you logged in to share information and participate. And it is, by the way, very chronological. And most people seem to really like that, but there are some people I've noticed who've come to rely on the algorithmic nature of things like Twitter, where it kind of condenses out those things that are really popular. And so I suspect over time, we'll end up in a bit of a hybrid. But for now, it is very, very just very chronological. In terms of costs, it's for the first over 5 years, I paid for it out of my pocket. Just again because I care about this community, and I have a pretty well-paying job, and I can afford it. As we started to grow, though, that
44,000 users, yeah,
got a little out of hand. And Mastodon, by the way, does great. Like it is. I know there's a lot of sometimes unkind comments about it. It's written in Rails, and it uses Sidekick and Puma and some other components that are maybe not the most modern, but it actually works pretty well. And it particularly at small numbers of users. But as you get into the larger numbers of users, you have to start breaking the infrastructure into components, and so right now I think the instance is hosted on about 17 servers. And that, by the way, has some headroom for growth. Like when I built the current environment, we were growing between 1,000 and 2,000 accounts per day, and I had no idea when it was going to stop. And even still, we're growing 200 to 500 accounts per day, and so it's having some extra capacity is still pretty important. But we're entirely focused or funded based off of donations and what I chip in personally.
So that sounds a little scary to someone who might want to get started. A 17 server cluster, I'm assuming you've got a couple running a database and some things like that. Can it all run on one server for a very small instance?
Yeah, I would say for the first 4 years, it ran in a VPS. Is just a single VPS that I paid like $500 a year for. So that worked pretty well. It worked in fact up until the spring of 2022, when the first Twitter migration surge happened, and that actually caused an outage for about a week where I had to rebuild, and I swallowed hard and bought or rented a 16 core server at Hetzner. And that server worked super well until about November 5th or so. It was interesting. I was I have a place at the beach. I was at the beach working on a conference call, and I had I have notifications. I was pretty active on Twitter. I had notifications on Twitter turned on, and haven't been super active for a while, so I don't get notifications that often. And I was on some meetings for work, and I started getting these notifications, like a lot of notifications. And it turns out that it was people, defecting and recommending they move over to the instance that I run. And so I logged in, and I was like, I would get a notification on Mastodon, in my Mastodon feed, every time somebody created an account. And for a while, it sounded like a machine gun, like just
Oh boy.
the rate at which people were signing up was just really incredible. And it was it worked. That one server ran perfectly through about, I would say, 8,000 users. And once we got past that, it started to choke. And then I had to move the database off, and then then there was another bottleneck, and then I had to move the Sidekick jobs to separate systems, and that worked for a while. And then so eventually I ended up with this kind of multi-tiered, clustered environment where I have a load balancer, a set of web servers, a set of streaming media servers. I moved the content, the object store to Backblaze, and use bunny.net CDN, so it ended up being this kind of sprawling infrastructure that took a while to put together, because as I like to describe it, I was kind of like rebuilding the airplane as we were like in the air.
I guess it's good that Mastodon at least has that capability to break it into different pieces and scale out. Otherwise it would be a problem.
Absolutely.
So anything else people should know before we wrap up, or anything else you'd like to talk about?
The one thing I will say is, as a community, it's been, and I don't say this like it's because it's the instance I run. I've been absolutely stunned at how awesome the security community is that's landed on the instance and on other associated instances. It's just truly remarkable to watch and have been part of, to watch, especially in an environment that doesn't kind of foster this conflict, to watch how helpful people are to each other, how the kindness that people give to each other, the people who have been so willing to donate both time and money, from their own time and their own money to help support this instance. The moderation team has just been absolutely phenomenal. I'm so pleased and so touched to be part of this. So it's just been an amazing experience.
Well, that's just awesome to hear. It's always nice to end on a very positive note. Hey, Jerry, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and looking forward to seeing how things proceed with infosec.exchange.
Awesome. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.